how should Americans best respond to the crisis that has arisen after George Floyd's senseless death? What do we want other democracies to learn from our response to this crisis?
Well, I'll start. One of the things that I think that's really important that's come out of this is that I think a lot of people really thought, well, we've come so far, and didn't think about the second part, how far we have to go. And, while we have sort of an interesting history in racial relations, especially because of the slave trade and how long it was here, we're not the only country that really grapples with racial tension. And some of that is about their own past histories and colonialism, and some of it is about immigration and xenophobia and how you deal with that. And so I think we all have to take a step back and say, okay, this is the work we've done. Great. What is next? And I hope that that part of the conversation, what we do going forward, can be a model for other countries who are not quite at the same part of this conversation that we're at. They're going to have these continuing conversations as long as we continue to have a global society with people moving about. And so this is something where hopefully we can be a model going forward, even if we haven't been perfect in the past.
David, how about you?
I think there are two issues that are related that we have to confront, and it's important that we demonstrate to the world that we are prepared to acknowledge them and confront them. One is the issue of police brutality against African Americans and minorities, where we see a disproportionate use of force against African Americans, leading to the cases like George Floyd and others. And I think we have to recognize that there is a systemic problem here. This is not just a matter of bad apples. The broader issue, and it's related to the one I just mentioned, is racial inequality. And we have that as one of our original sins. We were founded as a nation with slavery built into our Constitution. And we are still, I think, recovering from that original sin. And we have to recognize that we have lots of progress still to make, even though, as Laura mentioned, we have made lots of progress over the centuries, but lots of progress still to go in order for every citizen to be treated equally, to have an equal opportunity to succeed, to live a life freely. And I think if we can do that, we can restore ourselves as the shining city on the hill.
Tony?
Well, I think democracies start to falter or suffer from deficits when there's a sense that governments aren't accountable. And in the Floyd situation, this police brutality or the overreach as relates to a particular population, there was a sense that somehow those that we depended on for security weren't also accountable to the population broadly, in particular the African American population in the United States. And the second, I think they start to suffer when one doesn't feel as though they are fully enfranchised or fully a part of a participatory democracy. And I think in that sense, many of us really were probably left asking ourselves, do we really appreciate, do we really have a sense of what the African American, the Black Americans experience in this country is today? Why this sense of disenfranchisement? We think we've come so far, yet there was an entire population out there, community, that felt as though they weren't quite a part of this voyage in having come so far. So I think there are a couple of things, and how we address it. I think it's really critical in terms of how we're seen by the rest of the world. Since I was a young person back in my college days, in fact, on the blotter under my desk right now that I've always written, every time I rip off the page, I write free markets, free peoples, and America's role in the world. And America's role in the world can be as an example. And I think in that sense, how we go forward addressing this really tragic and situation is critical.
This second edition of Democracy Talks is focusing on a couple of isms that President Bush often talks about, including nativism, protectionism, and isolationism. So I'd like to ask the three of you, what do these isms, what challenges they present to democracies? What impact do you see nationalism, isolationism, nativism, protectionism having on democracies, including those in our own hemisphere?
I'll jump in, not because I think I have an answer, but because I have an impulse. I think a lot of those isms have to do with our failing to appreciate that, isolationism, for example. If you look at democracy and the strength of democracy built in the wake of World War II, it was an appreciation for a community of nations that were committed to democracy and freedom. And whether it was NATO or the World Trade Organization or these multilateral organizations, almost paradoxically, by being involved in a multilateral environment with a commitment to certain values, we had more control of our sovereignty and democracy as peoples. And these isms seem to, I think, we grew a bit complacent around what that meant. And I also think that we've got to be honest within countries, there are great disparities in inequality and wealth and these sorts of things. And that leads to this sense of disenfranchisement within countries. And when people don't feel like they have a voice in that democracy, in that participatory government, they look to the autocrat, they look to the strong man. And it's easy to step in with those nationalism, isolationism, protectionism, as though that were an answer, as though it were an alternative to democracy. So I think sometimes it's simply that we've been so successful in promoting sort of a rule of law and a values-based democracy in the wake of World War II, and the Soviet Union failed in the 80s. We didn't get out and promote it enough, and didn't realize that there were some people that were feeling left behind. And when that number reached a critical mass, that isms and the authoritarianism stepped in that wake.
Well, I'll jump in. I mean, I think these isms are disturbing and dangerous, but we can't simply write them off and dismiss them, because if we do, then we run the risk of actually entrenching them. We have to address the underlying causes of some of these things. And as Tony just said, there are large segments of our populations, and I use populations plural because it isn't just the United States, we see it elsewhere, who feel left out of the system, who feel neglected, forgotten, that the elites are running the show to their own benefit and don't care about the average citizen. So I think there has been a trend over the years where the political parties and political leaders have created this impression that they aren't listening, that they don't care, that they're focused on what's happening within their own world, and people feel that they're being left behind. Mm-hmm. Modernization has been, for the most part, a very positive phenomenon. Globalization has also been a phenomenon that has contributed benefits, but there are also people who are being left behind the process. And so I think we have to recognize that we have to take a more inclusive approach, because if we do so, then I think we reduce the incentive for people to resort to these isms that you've described. Mm-hmm. Populism is the isms you identified, Lindsay, lead to populism, and then populism can also lead to authoritarianism. And I think we have to be very mindful of that and recognize that each of us has a role and responsibility in trying to help the other look out for the greater good, while also helping our own families and ourselves. We should be able to do both things and recognize that there are people who just feel completely left out of the process, and simply writing them off and hope that they'll never vote again is not the way forward.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think one of the things that is difficult about this conversation sometimes, especially in terms of things like protectionism, is you can look at the data and say, well, we're not really hurt by trade. None of these workers are actually hurt by trade, but their perception of what happened to them is so real. And so perception matters a lot too. And to the extent that we can find ways to help them along, to get past that point where they're feeling pain from something, even if it's perceived pain, it does matter so much that you feel like people listen and acknowledge your hurt, even if we can look at the data and say, well, on a macro level, though, you're not hurt. That still doesn't change the fact that they feel something very deeply.
Laura, it's funny because you said on a macro level, and as you know, I served in Mexico for a number of years and still live there. But whenever I would talk about trade, if you were talking to a community of business people that understood it on that macro level, there was a lot of support. And I remember being amongst a group and trying to talk about it just that way. And one of the fellows leaned over to me, he says, macro's fine, but what about el mío, which means what about mine? And it was interesting because we hadn't been able, or to him, the benefit of trade had not been translated to something much more personal. And that was him, although this was a person that was working in trade, but at a much smaller level. I think sometimes in countries, and I just saw something recently about Latin America, where when government isn't delivering what they should be doing well, people start to get cynical about the democracy, and it creates those little spaces where these strongmen can step in and say, but I can get this done for you. And it was interesting. One was, if somebody personally had been the victim of a crime, or somebody personally had experienced governmental corruption, or somebody personally had seen or been victim to an extortion, then their confidence in democracy starts to wane, and that creates that. So it's not only government and accountability, it's transparency and actually doing these things well. And I think sometimes it's the little things that start to create those deficits and lack of confidence that people have in democracy.
Well, we've seen this with coronavirus, right? I mean, and this hasn't happened here because we're not so unstable as to need this, but you see in a lot of places where government has completely failed its people, where you have non-governmental actors, not always good ones, stepping in to help people with basic hygiene and supplies. And we see it in Mexico. I know you've seen this, Tony. We see it in Central America some too. And that's not what you really want. You don't want those bad actors to come in and fill the power void. And so at a baseline, you know, government has to get a few things right. And if they can't even do that, you know, people aren't going to trust that they're going to be able to rely on anybody to help them other than the people who really want to harm them in the end.
Right.
I just wanted to add one other element to the conversation, and that is the changing demographics. We certainly see that here in the United States. It's a cliche, we're a land of immigrants. It's true. We haven't been an entirely successful melting pot, however, because there are areas that have distinct identities and other parts of areas don't interact with those different demographic groups. And yet demographics sometimes don't always explain the appeal of the isms that we're talking about. If you look at a country like Hungary or Poland, they're pretty homogeneous, and yet the outside groups are held up as a threat to Hungarian or Polish identity. I think you're seeing some of that here in the United States, where immigrants are viewed as threatening the identity of the United States of Americans. I find that an argument that I certainly don't support, but I think we have to recognize that there is growing anti-immigrant sentiment here that the current administration has tapped into. And we have to underscore the importance of immigration, the movement of people, given the tremendous value and contributions that immigrants on the whole make in this country.
I'm going to agree and disagree. I actually think the melting pot works quite well. And I think we can see evidence of that in that we do successfully integrate every single wave of immigrants that comes in. The perception is that we don't, because when you haven't seen the end of a wave and you still see, you know, people coming in as speaking their native language, that messes with people's perception. And one of the things that I think is really indicative of the melting pot is that salsa's been outselling ketchup since the mid 1990s. And so you can't tell me that we haven't successfully integrated people and fully embraced other cultures and really adopted them as our own if the melting pot's not working. But, you know, this actually goes back a little bit to the point about the macro. You know, what we find a lot in immigration is, yes, it's good for the country. Yes, it's good for the economy, but it's concentrated benefits, right? If you live in a community with a lot of immigrants, you're going to get those concentrated benefits and your perception of immigrants is going to go up. If you don't live in one of those communities, you're just going to be afraid, because the political rhetoric is, well, those people are just coming across the border to hurt you. And so much of this is, who are you interacting with? What do you see in your own community? And how does that affect your perception?
Yeah. You know, the other thing on immigration in particular, and I think this is true in countries around the world, but I think we've seen it in the United States, we place a value on immigration, and we see it as part of something that we've always been welcoming. But the truth is, it's never been easy. If you look at the debates around any of the immigration reform, whether it was the original in the 20s or later in the 50s or in the 80s, and you look into the debates that were had, there was some pretty aggressive nativist strident stuff, and it took some real leadership. And many of these things were much like trade. They were passed on narrow margins at a time that it took some real doubling down on leadership. And I think that's perhaps part of the challenge, is that when you have such well-organized opposition, larger but less organized beneficiaries of it, because I think as a country we're all the beneficiaries, then that's when leadership matters. And I think on some of these tougher issues, that's where we've seen a little, we've been lacking on some of these larger issues because they're not easy. Trade is not easy, and immigration's not easy. Ultimately, we've seen the benefits, and I think maybe that speaks to the complacency that I alluded to a second ago. We've had 5-6 decades in the post-World War II of this boom in democracy and growth and moving people out of poverty, and then a little complacency perhaps in the last couple of decades, and we've seen the rise of these isms.
Let me just take it out a little bit. I mean, this is a fascinating conversation. I'd like to focus on maybe take it out a level about how democracies, especially in our own hemisphere, have been turning inward. We're seeing resistance to trade. We're seeing resistance to, here in our own country, to perhaps withdrawing from different treaties or international organizations and so forth. What can democracies do? What can we do to sort of fight that urge to turn inward? How do we encourage countries, including our own, to continue to stay engaged internationally?
Our leaders, but also our educators, need to underscore the important role the United States has played in helping form and shape and perpetuate the liberal international order that has served us incredibly well since the end of World War II. Mm-hmm. And without the United States playing a leading role in that, I do worry that some of our fellow democratic allies will pull back as well. We need to play that role. It's not to say that we have to be everywhere, that we don't have to be the world's policeman, but the United States has both led by example and by action. And I think that is something that we need to underscore, that the collapse of communism was something that took decades. And it took the United States as, again, both a model of a democracy, of how people can live in a free society, but it also took the ability of the United States to contain, if not even sometimes confront, the Soviet Union and communism in ways to push back. And without the communist Soviet threat anymore, we still face enormous challenges from authoritarian regimes like China and Russia, a different threat from Iran, problems in our own hemisphere, in Venezuela and Cuba. But the United States needs to continue to play the leading role in this. And if we don't, then we fall back into the patterns we've seen in the 20s, 30s, and other times that didn't turn out so well for anyone.
David, I know you just were responding to that, but I would like to direct this question toward you, and would invite Laura and Ambassador Garza to respond as well. But earlier, you mentioned about the importance of noting people who had been left behind and who feel frustrated by what's going on in the world. And I think about the transitioning globalized economy that seems to be going from one to one that's more information-based. And I wonder, how can democracies best respond to the protectionism that I think is sprouting up because of some of this transition?
There's no question that the pace with which change is occurring is faster and faster. I can't keep up with it, and frankly, I've almost given up in trying to keep up with it at my age. But other people don't have that luxury. And so it's critically important that we invest in education, that we invest in skills, so that every citizen has the opportunity to stay engaged, fully employed in a quickly moving economic situation. We can't simply say that we're going to bring back all manufacturing jobs and only focus on those at the expense of other sectors. We have to do all of these things at once. Mm-hmm. And so it's enormous challenges for us, but closing our doors both to trade or to people coming in is definitely not the answer. Some of the people coming into our country come in with amazing skills. They're doctors, they're entrepreneurs, whatever the case may be, and they can make enormous contributions to our society. And we can benefit from learning from them just as they can benefit from learning from the skills that we bring to the table as well.
You know, I agree with all of that. And I think leadership matters, and America's role in the world matters. It's something that I feel with every fiber of my body. Education and these sorts of things, really, whether it be in the United States or in countries abroad, is fundamental. I mean, how can you participate intelligently or hold anyone accountable without that basic tool of the democratic marketplace, and that's an education. But the third, and I think it's interesting, and not to go too far afield on this, but it's a conversation that we're having in boardrooms across America, is the whole role of ESG, environmental, social, and governance, and being responsible members of communities, business that is, and seeing their responsibility not just to shareholders but stakeholders writ large, and you know, the language is around building long-term value, which is ultimately what you want to do in the corporate model. And if companies do that, not only in the United States but around the world, in many respects, for many countries, the face of America is our business. And when we are responsible and leading with some of these initiatives and really truly being part of communities, not simply seeing lowest cost production in some offshore, I think that also matters. So I think not only do we as a country, and education is critical, but I think American businesses around the world are recognizing that they have a responsibility to this marketplace, and they have a responsibility to lead on these issues of democracy around the world.
I actually think that if we're just talking about investing in trade adjustment assistance or even education, we're stopping short of what's needed, because I think we're going to have a broad cultural shift in the idea of what it means to get an education and have a career. So a lot of people view graduation, whether it's a high school diploma or an associate's degree or a bachelor's degree, as the end of their education journey, and they're going to have a career. And that's just not the way the market works anymore. I think we need to start understanding, and I think the younger generations already understand this, that you may have multiple careers in your lifetime. Mm-hmm. And so how do you flip that switch in your brain to say, okay, I'm going to continuously learn new skills. I'm going to work towards whatever's next, and start looking on the horizon, instead of being able to be comfortable in the fact that you have this education, you've got a degree, and that's what you're going to be for the rest of your life. And that's just not the way the market is anymore, because the world changes so fast and technology has changed so fundamentally in the last 20, 25 years. So, that's going to take a big adjustment. I think the younger generations are already understanding that. It'll be interesting to see if they actually implement that and actually work towards it.
And, I think I just add one other quick thing. I think a lot of workers feel that other countries are stealing our jobs, that companies are going overseas for manufacturing and other purposes. A lot of people in this country think that immigrants are stealing their jobs. And a lot of people think that technology is stealing their jobs. So they feel under threat from a whole range of areas. And I think we just have to address that and help them deal with it and adjust to the changing environment.
Yeah, it's not enough to tell them like, no, that's not true. You have to acknowledge their pain, right? You have to say and I don't want to diminish them by saying this, but I have young children, and if they're upset about something, even if it doesn't matter whatsoever, totally made up, you have to say, I know you're upset, or you'll never get anywhere with them. And so we do have to make sure and acknowledge people's feelings. Emotions really matter in this conversation.
I'm going to turn it over to Bill in just a moment to wrap us up. But I was inspired, Laura, by your comment on salsa. But also, I thought you rightly pointed out how it's interesting how people who aren't exposed to more immigrant communities tend to have a fear. And I'm wondering, I'll start with you, Laura, and if anyone else has comments, would love to hear them. But as you think about the flow people across borders for whatever reason, and you think about the fear that generates in some folks, to what extent do you think that's related to either a national or cultural, a loss of a national or cultural identity, and what might democracies do to address that fear?
Yeah, I think that goes to really the heart of it, is that people are very afraid that their way of life is going to change. And so, we see this so much in immigration in the United States, because they can look back and say, well, my my German grandparents spoke English, and they forget that their German grandparents probably also read a German language newspaper, right? And so we really have a lot of work to do, not just on the government side, but as communities. How are we doing our part to fully welcome people who are coming here and help them adjust? We know that they're going to be more successful if they learn English. We also know that more exposure to different people sort of lessens that pain and lessens that anxiety. And when we're doing immigration policy in the US, what we're really doing is we're creating new Americans. So how do we affirmatively move forward with making sure that people we're bringing in are fully assimilated or integrated, whichever term you prefer, making sure that they're successful, and making sure that everybody at the same time is building towards that collectively. It's not just about what government can do. It's not just what about immigrant communities do. It's how do all of us as communities adopt and help bring them up together.
Yeah. And I think we also have to remember that the whole American experience has constantly been evolving and growing and becoming stronger. And we've led for a long time. I like to say nostalgia is not a policy, because what you look back on very fondly as a Latino or a Black person may not have been a time that we want to return to. So America is, I think, led by always being very forward looking. And that's what we have to, we can't fear looking forward. And we have to be willing to call people out that nostalgia in and of itself is a policy. It's not. Forward looking and leading is really what we want, the direction that we want to constantly be going as a country.
Let me wrap us up with a question that Laura somewhat touched upon a little while ago, and that is the impact that the coronavirus, the pandemic, may be having on democratic stability. So how can democracies best respond to this crisis so that we don't see a resurgence or exacerbation of nativism, isolationism, populism?
I think there actually might be a moment. I don't think the populists and authoritarians of the world are doing particularly well in the wake of the COVID virus. Have you seen Bolsonaro in Brazil or Putin in Russia or in China? I think that a bit on the wane. On the other hand, you've seen, in New Zealand, Merkel in Germany, you've seen those that have been transparent, those that have been honest with their populations, those that have led about what needs to be done to address the COVID virus, I think are doing a bit better. The challenge is going to be in the wake of it consolidating the notion that transparency and accountability and the respect for human rights and rule of law and all these things matter. So I think, maybe in the wake of it, there's another moment for the kind of leadership on democracy that will help consolidate us and move us forward. Or I'm hopeful.
I'll just add, and sorry for the hesitation because I'm waiting for my dogs to bark any second. The Economist has written that over 80 countries have passed laws or provided powers to the executive in light of the pandemic that go beyond the normal democratic norms. And I think we have to recognize that the pandemic did force on many societies and many governments the responsibility to restrict some fundamental freedoms that we have enjoyed over many years. The freedom of movement, the freedom of assembly and association. And there has to be a clear path forward. Those freedoms will be fully restored once the pandemic is dealt with. Public health has created this exigency that is kind of, if you will, pardon the expression, trumped some of these freedoms. And we have to make sure that this is temporary, and we have to make sure that we return to our full democratic path. There's also the challenge, though, that we face, and Lindsay wrote a great piece about this when it comes to China and Hong Kong, that the authoritarian regimes are viewing this as an opportunity, that we are distracted. They're not wrong in perceiving it that way. We're not able to focus on the threats that they are posing to places like Hong Kong, pressure on Taiwan, pressure on Ukraine, pressure on Georgia coming from Russia. So we have to be able to address the public health crisis, preserve our democratic principles and institutions, while also recognizing that we still face challenges overseas. Nobody's been able to find the pause button to say that bad actors are going to hit a pause while we get our own house in order. We have to get our own house in order while also dealing with the threats from other bad actors out there.
So true.
I am watching to see how public opinion changes the longer the pandemic goes on in the United States about immigrants, because we know before this that we were at pretty high levels of acceptance of immigrants and understanding that immigrants do good things for the United States. But there's overwhelming support for a temporary pause in immigration. And the justification that the administration put forth for that was, we don't want to import the virus. Well, I think if you look at the infection numbers, that's really not the fear anymore and shouldn't be. So I will be interested to see at what point the public reaches a tipping point on that for their opinion, you know, because it's clear that this virus is not slowing down here just because we've shut down the borders.
Well, thank you all very much.
All right.
This has been excellent. We could keep going with this for another hour or so. You all were just really wonderful.
Thank you, Bill.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
For having us.
Thanks for the
Yeah.
opportunity.
Good being
And
with
good
you.
to see you
All right.
all.